I think we've got a
big buggy boy.
We've got a big turnout, so I think I'm going to start proceedings. So welcome to everybody here. Just to take note, we are recording this. We were asked by one or two people who can't make it whether we could make the recording available. So there should be a video of this also available sometime after the meeting. So just to note that this event here is to celebrate somebody's muting me. Amy, if you're muting me, please don't. Yeah. This is also a year in which we're celebrating 21 years of DataFirst. So this is hopefully going to be the first of a number of other events which will look at some of the data issues and achievements over the past 2 decades or so. So the program, so I'm going to give a quick introduction to proceedings, and then we'll hand over to Andrew Carr, who's going to talk a little bit about what PALMS is and some of the things that we've learned about the labor market from it. Then Nicola is going to talk about some of her research on education, and we're going to finish the sort of formal presenter side, David Lamb, who will talk a little bit about looking at PALMS kind of from the outside, from the US. What we want to do is then throw the floor open for comments, discussions, mainly focusing on where should we take PALMS to, because there are actually questions around how useful the exercise has been and what we should be doing. Yeah, so I'm going to just kick off very quickly to give some background to where PALMS came from. And that is just to note that prior to '93, there was really no real data sets, micro data sets that were available. So people worked off the tabulations from the census and other things, but it's really only after '93 that we see micro data sets arriving, and then they arrive in force. So there are a lot of data sets that became available in the late '90s, the October household surveys, the first income and expenditure survey of '95, a bunch of surveys done by academics like KIDS, then CAPS in the early 2000s. And one of the key things that researchers were interested in was to use these data sets to track changes over time. So what had happened since democracy, what happened to South Africa, and what were some of the lessons to be learned. Unfortunately, doing this was quite time intensive, so a lot of researchers would just pick 2 data sets. OHS 95, OHS 99 were quite popular for some of these analyses. And then you kind of talk about a trend based on those 2 data points. And the reality is that the more data sets that you use, the more complicated things got, because the variable names, variable definitions, all of that changed over time. So you just created a lot of work for yourself if you wanted to work with more than 2 data sets. And one of the problems is that researchers could come up with different answers. So a lot of the data cleaning, I mean, how you stack these things up, different people have made different choices, and depending on what you used as your base point and as your end point, the series could look different. By the mid-2000s, we also became aware that there were problems when you just put data sets together. So Nicola Branson's master's dissertation already showed that there were some big problems with the weights in the data sets that were available. And she released a set of harmonized weights by the late 2000s. And then other people, including Reza Daniels and work for his PhD, showed that that there were breaks which were not just variable definition types, but also, how the questions were phrased that led to changes in the actual measurements, kind of like, so how you treated bracket responses, the don't knows, could actually impact on the conclusions that you were getting. So by the end of the 2000s, around 2010, Murray and I made an application to the Vice Chancellor's Fund at UCT to fund work on harmonizing the data. And we appointed Andrew Carr as research officer in 2011 in DataFirst. And I must say, it was the best decision I think I've made in my academic life. So hiring Andrew, and he then ran with this project for the last 10 years. A big sort of jump start to the whole process was given by the fact that David Lamb had already done quite a lot of harmonization in a transparent way. He had codes for the LFSs, which he gave to us. And so with that work and Andrew's independent work, we released the first version of PALMS in March 2012, 13th of March 2012 to be precise, I think. So it literally is 10 years since PALMS has been in the public domain. And from our point of view, the purpose of PALMS was really fourfold. So the first three objectives were already in the first release of PALMS. So enable people to work with many, many more data sets than just two. So preferably use all of them if one can. And the second thing, which is really important, is to make the decisions in a way that other people could potentially challenge or undo. So basically, we've always released the code that's gone into creating PALMS with the data set so that one can rule out differences between analysts based on different data cleaning routines. So hopefully those, the base period, end period issues and the data cleaning issues could be taken off the table if people are getting different results. And then, of course, building on Nicola's work, we've released always consistent weights for the entire series. By the time that PALMS 2 came around, we'd also worked on the earnings variables in a way that that enabled people to kind of really work with earnings in a sort of more transparent and comparable sense over time. So that was kind of like the baseline objectives for PALMS. That's what PALMS was set up to do. And I now hand over to Andrew, who will talk about some of the lessons that we've learned over the years that we've produced PALMS, and some of the ways in which PALMS has contributed to the debate.
Thanks, Martin. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen. It's just not yet full screen. Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Nice to see everyone here. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the introduction, Martin. I'm going to talk briefly about what PALMS is and a few lessons. So there's a few who know very little. So for those who know little, I might not give you a huge amount more information about what it is, but I'll try and describe some of the basics. Yeah, and it's about promises and pitfalls in thinking about the labour market. Sorry, just going to organize my screen a bit better. So, as probably most of you know, PALMS is a compilation of, at the moment, 69 household surveys. So Martin said a lot. There's 69 of them conducted between 1993 and 2019. They've all been conducted by Statistics South Africa. That's the October household surveys, labour force surveys, and quarterly labour force surveys. And we also have the 1993 PSLSD, which was run by SALDRU as the very first survey in PALMS. And the latest version, 3.3, was released in 2019. And I'll have something more to say about that at the end. Who's used PALMS? Alison sent out an email to the 685 people who've downloaded it from DataFirst. So perhaps not all have opened the data, but anyway, 685 people have downloaded it. If you look in Google Scholar, it's mentioned 204 times and cited around 120 times. It's a bit difficult to count exactly the citations, but and that's partly because there are many instances where the data is not cited correctly or not cited at all. I just checked one irritating one today which said we use PALMS. There was no explanation of what PALMS is, or certainly no description of the hours of sweat that Martin and I and David put into developing the code for it. It's been cited in a bunch of different journals, books, 3 PhD dissertations at least have used it, and lots of master's theses. Mostly by economists, but also by sociologists and people in urban studies. It's being used in debates about the national minimum wage that was introduced in 2019. It's also been used by Stats South Africa themselves, for example, in a joint inequality report with SALDRU. And Martin and myself were involved in setting up and running the postgraduate diploma in survey data analysis for development. And that program trained by now around 50 Stats SA employees, partly by making students use PALMS. We use other data sets also, but the idea was to get people familiar with surveys that their own institution was creating, and that included using PALMS. It's currently being used in the National Treasury project with the Harvard Growth Lab. So very briefly, a few little bits and pieces about what we learned about the labour market from PALMS. So this is unemployment rates. I'm sure this is not unfamiliar to many of you. Strict unemployment rate increased from around 12%. Sorry, the axes are a little bit different. This is the broad unemployment rate axis. This is the strict unemployment rate axis. So strict from around 12% to around 25%, and the broad from perhaps 30 to 40%. You can already see some kind of measurement error problem, or measurement problem, perhaps better to say, right around the time that the QLFS was introduced. There was a big drop-off in the broad unemployment rate in the QLFS, and it's now increased rapidly again. Perhaps this is a bit surprising to you, something that I see people making errors about on Twitter all the time. Despite unemployment increasing pretty substantially, you can probably say that the employment rate has increased a few percentage points And this was, I think, perhaps for me at least, one of the more surprising things. I hadn't thought much about that. I knew, unemployment is high and it's got worse. But I think it was some time after the process of creating PALMs and putting it out there that I kind of realized that the employment rate has probably increased. So you can see the big increase here over the period of growth from the early 2000s up till 2008, a big recovery, and then in the last few years, this is all pre-COVID, I haven't put any COVID period into these graphs, but some sort of stagnation or maybe even slight decline. PSLSD looks a little bit strange. So as Martin said, if you started in 1993 and used one point at the end, you would have got a big decline. If you used one of these points over here, you would have got even much more of a large decline. And so it does help, I think, to at least make sense of what happened, to have as many data points as possible. These three over here look too low. Hostels were not surveyed. I'll get onto that in a little bit. In two of these points over here, and all were affected by an undersampling of small households, which are much more likely to have higher employment than larger households. What did we learn about informal employment? Well, there's some really strange things that happened in the early 2000s. So subsistence agriculture, this red line over here, increased to a high of around 1.5 million, after which it dropped back down to perhaps 300,000 or 400,000, never to attain the same heights again. And informal self-employment hit also a massive high in the third LFS. That's March 2001. Stats South Africa paid its enumerators extra if they found people who were in informal self-employment, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they then found a whole lot more people in informal self-employment. And that also was never repeated in the subsequent periods. So that was also a little bit strange. I've taken out the subsistence agriculture people from this graph. So it's employed preferred is the variable in PALMs. So we take out the strange subsistence agriculture people. But still, the early 2000s looked very odd as a result of these trends, which are not replicated in any of the other surveys. What did we learn about earnings? This was Martin's baby, producing a whole lot of amazing code that harmonized the huge variety of questions, particularly in the OHSs and the PSLSD, about earnings, and trying to make sure that all the earnings variables were aligned, and there was in the end just one nice one that everyone could use. I'm not so sure about these larger percentiles for the 50th. This is the median, 25th and 10 right at the beginning. I'm more comfortable saying that perhaps we should start around the early 2000s. But the problem then is that we really only have, I think, 7 years, maybe a few more over here, of reliable earnings data. And then we see these very strange drop-offs at the median, at the 25th percentile and at the 10th percentile, and also in the 75th percentile, and not as much of a drop-off, but at least stagnation in the 90th percentile. And this is one of the concerns, and something that I'm hoping to get some feedback from at the end from you all. Stats South Africa's earnings data in the QLFS is not very good. And here's my latest attempt at showing that. These are, someone talking to me? No, someone's leaving. These are, again, the median, 25th percentile and 10th percentile, GHS and the QLFS. They both have pretty much identical questions on earnings. For the most part, they're conducted in exactly the same primary sampling units, the small enumeration areas, pieces of ground that Stats South Africa uses, and yet wildly different numbers on earnings. No huge drop-off in either of these 3 percentiles that I'm showing. And this has substantive implications around about the time of the minimum wage. These are in 2019 rands, but in nominal terms, just before the implementation of the national minimum wage, the median wage was supposed to be about the monthly equivalent, full-time monthly equivalent of the national minimum wage. So that was about 3,500 rand a month. And the median in the QLFS at the time was 3,500. But actually, if you go and have a look at the GHS, 3,500 is actually about at the 35th percentile. So that's 15% more of employees were earning above the minimum wage according to the GHS compared to the QLFS at the same time. So we can have a debate about what's an appropriate level to set the minimum wage at, but just the fact that it was set at a very different level, if you believe the GHS versus you believe the QLFS, that's obviously something important, and I don't think was on anyone's radar, perhaps, and sadly, everyone was using palms and no one went and looked at the GHS. So I went to a Stats South Africa public engagement on the QLFS in 2013 in Pretoria and complained about the fact that there were no imputation flags or ways of finding out what the real values of earnings were. Stats South Africa imputed earnings in 2011, 10, and the first half of 2012 completely. There was no missing data at all. And then from Q3 2012 onwards, partial imputation with a bunch of people who's sitting in the refusal category. And unfortunately, despite lots of efforts, we haven't managed to persuade Stats South Africa to publicly release unimputed earnings data. We've got some ourselves for 2011, 1 quarter of 2012, and now 1 quarter of 2020, but that's not really enough to say much about what happened. But if you use, I've been using 2020, and unsurprisingly, the QLFS looks, this is pre-COVID, 1st quarter of 2020, COVID, the QLFS looks exactly like the GHS. So these kind of numbers over here, and that's another piece of evidence that the earnings imputations that are undertaken don't seem to be very good. So if any of you have any power at Stats South Africa, please try and encourage them to release unimputed earnings data. As Martin mentioned in the beginning, you want to ask or answer how has something changed since 1994. That can be a very difficult question to answer if the surveys that were done around the beginning of that period were not done well or had problems or were not comparable to each other. And so as when I say, what did we learn? I guess I'm meaning Martin and myself, primarily in the research that we've undertaken as part of putting palms together. So hostels, some of these, I'm not saying we were the first people to say all these things over here, but certainly things that I learned as part of putting palms together. So Stats South Africa, if you go back to the OHS reports, they say hostels were not sampled at all in 1996 and 1997 because of violence. There were substantial changes in October Household Survey 1999 to do with sampling. That was the first year in which the census, the 1996 census, the first democratic census, was used to draw the sample. Small households were undersampled by the way in which Stats South Africa did their sampling. There were some very strange and probably unrealistic declines in household size as a result of them, Stats South Africa, correctly adjusting and sampling the right fractions of small households from 1999 onwards. and you saw that in the beginning, the PSLSD 1993 also looks a little bit strange on some things. So that's difficult. And then PALMs could not, and I think this is a point Martin likes to make, PALMs can't solve the underlying survey issues for the most part. We can make them more obvious by putting in all the data together, so we're not just using one point at the start and one point at the end, but it is difficult to undo problems that crept in the surveys. We can do something about them, so excluding subsistence agriculture people from employment, given that there were these strange things in the early 2000s, and then that Stats South Africa excluded them completely from the definition of employment in 2008. That's something that you can do to make sense of the data over a longer period of time, but some of the things it's just not possible to undo. As part of the process, we also made Donald Tryman, he's a sociologist at UCLA, now retired, and he ran a survey in the early 90s, which we've made publicly available, but not put into PALMs as yet. Excuse me. I think I've already said this. Well, we learned the limitations, some of the limitations of the different surveys, probably more than we wanted to. And most of these are written up, scattered across different papers, I think. And so one idea that I thought about is in preparation is to perhaps put some of these together in a paper that might be called What Not to Do with PALMs. I've been talking a lot about limitations and criticisms, but just a big picture thought. We're working in an area in which the South African state is relatively strong. So Stats South Africa, I think, doesn't get enough credit for the good things that it does, certainly compared to big other parts of the South African state, which are in much worse shape. That being said, for example, it would be relatively easy to put QLFS unimputed earnings into the public domain. And I guess it is frustrating that these kind of things haven't taken place despite quite a lot of effort on our part. So that's sort of what did we learn about the data, but just some personal reflections. This was my first real job. Martin mentioned I got hired in May 2011. We put out the first version in March 2012. I was still trying to finish my PhD. I told Martin that I would do that when I joined, and sorry, Martin, that wasn't right. Well, it wasn't on purpose, but I didn't manage to complete it. I finished a few months later, and while finishing and after finishing, I appreciated the opportunity to do something like the very beginning stages of setting up PALMs. It was partly a kind of clerical job. Obviously, you need to use data and whatever, but it wasn't a particularly difficult or complex thing to do in the start. Learning code from David and putting the surveys together, reading the survey documentation, and compared to the stress of PhD completion, it was a wonderful thing to be able to move over to in those few months of trying to do both. Yeah, I'd like to say thank you to Martin for having learned an enormous amount from him about surveys, data quality, and many things also. One reflection, I think I didn't confirm this with Martin, but I think the first version of PALMs didn't include the QLFS at all. So this was 2012, the QLFS had been going for 4 years, and we didn't put in any QLFS data. We started with OHS 94 and finished with the Labour Force Survey in 2007. And so we added in the QLFSs and the 1993 PSLSD later. And in the beginning, when we started adding in the QLFS, I think the idea was we want to put in things that were present in most of the surveys that came before. QLFS was just sort of at that stage an add-on. 3 or 4 years, we had 8 years of LFS and 6 years of OHSs. So let's try and just include things that were in at least the LFS but probably both the OHS and LFS. And so I think what that meant is that we've left out some stuff in the QLFS, which now that when PALMS was released 2019, we had 12 years of QLFS, it's now 15. There's a huge amount of stuff in there that isn't in the LFS and isn't in the OHS that probably should have ended up in PALMS that hasn't. So there's questions on job satisfaction, detailed questions on how many hours you work on each day of the week, previous occupation for those who are in unemployment. Some of these things might be interesting and useful, but haven't made it into PALMS, I think, because of this inertia of we started with things that from the QLFS that had been in both LFS and probably the OHS also. And we've also focused mainly on earnings and employment. There's stuff on unemployment also. I learned yesterday for the first time that we've not included any QLFS questions on educational enrollment, despite now having had QLFS in PALMS for probably 10 years, 9 years. So no one asked us for it, no one complained, so perhaps there wasn't any demand for that, but still, that's an example, I think, of where that's a crucial thing. It was there in the LFS and I think in the OHS also, but we just didn't, perhaps with our focus, too much of a focus maybe on earnings and employment or unemployment, we haven't remembered to include some other things. Thinking about PALMS household surveys in the future, specifically, first of all, in the sense of what has COVID done to household surveys, they've been affected by lockdowns and other restrictions in many places around the world, and that's true for Stats South Africa. Stats SA, I think, has done, in one sense, an amazing effort to adjust to doing a telephone survey very quickly. And the sample design, where they used to have a rotating panel, so they collected respondents' phone numbers, meant that they had the sample frame from only February 2020 to then draw on to survey people over the following periods. And there are some concerns about it. The weighting adjustments are a bit unclear and perhaps a bit strange. And I've just been reading recently that the response rate's now below 50% as a result, I think, of still using the same group of people from early 2020, just before COVID, resulted in lockdowns, etc. So that's something to be concerned about. The release of the most recent QLFS has been delayed. I hope not indefinitely, but that is something to worry about. So, and of course, this is going to affect PALMS. If we are putting out public data or a new version of PALMS, with dramatic declines in response rates, that's important for us to warn people about and potentially think about. And I think both COVID and the fact that the census 2022 is currently happening, should have happened already, but I think is still ongoing. These have both made it harder to convince Stats South Africa to make some other QLFS improvements. Releasing imputed earnings data is very minimal work, but nevertheless that hasn't happened. And the Stats South Africa Labour Stats budget is down pretty dramatically in real terms, so that also makes things harder. It's now 2.5 years since we released 0.3. I think it's the longest gap ever in releasing. So one question is, should we be releasing further versions of PALMS, particularly with earnings data when more and more we don't believe that data? I have a non-public version of PALMS version 3.4, but yeah, I'm a bit nervous about putting that into the public domain, given we've continued to learn about earnings. Perhaps there are other ways of doing this, changing focus to other types of data that's in the QLFS. We've been talking about doing a GHS version of PALMS, that's the General Household Survey. That's also got problems. There's lots of, there's very few questions about the labour market in the GHS. So it wouldn't be a very good substitute for PALMS. It would be good on its own. It's got lots of other interesting questions in it, but not so much as a good substitute for PALMS. And then some questions more for the audience to think about. What about funding public goods like PALMS? How should we think about that going forward? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So Nicola, can I ask you to jump in now?
Sure.
We'll take discussion right at the end.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. And I definitely have relied on PALMS for so many things even that didn't necessarily get into a paper. So yeah, I want to thank all three of you. So I've been asked to talk about education in PALMS, and I've only got 10 minutes. And the kind of things that came to mind are to talk a little bit about what variables are available in PALMS, and the kind of research that's been done, a few thoughts, and then to think a little bit more about post-school qualification measurements of higher education qualifications and what we can do with something like PALMS, and then some thoughts on measures and things going forward. So as Andrew sort of alluded to, there are actually very few variables about education in PALMS. And the key ones are, they've got the sort of highest educational attainment. So what is the highest level of education that you've completed? And this is a categorical variable with the sort of grades that you complete in school, and then a suite of categories related to education outside of basic education. These categories have changed over time, and in PALMS, they released in sort of 5 different versions that reflect these changes over time. Then something which I think many researchers use and might be grateful for is the derived variable in PALMS, which is called years of education. And this variable is derived from those education categories. And it's something that many economists use in regressions of sort of wages and labor market patterns. And obviously underlying that derivation is a set of assumptions about how these categories fit into the years of completed education. And Andrew also mentioned that there's fairly limited information on enrollment currently. So when I scanned the DataFirst website of sort of publications related to PALMS and thinking about education, sort of 3 main areas popped up. One is really partly something that's useful about PALMS is looking at these trends in educational attainment over time. And this is typically done either looking at both cohorts, so reflecting that children entering the schooling system at different times will, might have a different experience, and then also just cross-sectionally looking at years over time. And the research typically shows, different categories of education, and then subdividing it by gender and race. The second topic is very much about the sort of labor market returns to education, and it focuses on both sort of participating in the labor force and earnings, and again looks at sort of subcategories of interest there. And the final area, which is actually an area, a topic which David Lamb has sort of worked on quite extensively is really looking at the sort of relationship between schooling inequality, returns to schooling, and earnings inequality. And in all three categories, it's very much this focus on being able to look over time and see what the trends are and what this reflects. So I thought I'd just pop in a couple of figures because, and this is something that I've seen in a couple of papers coming out of different research areas, Safaris group and other authors as well. This is one using the latest version of the data, and it shows that if you take your years of education variable and you just categorize it by those who had no education, primary education, which in South Africa is under grade 7, incomplete secondary, which is classified as 8 to 11 years of education, matric, which is 12 years, or grade 12, and then tertiary, which is inclusive of anything more than 12 years of education. This is the trend that you get if you look at it cross-sectionally. So what you can see is the sort of expanding or this increase in average educational attainment over time across the different cohorts, the different years in PALMs. Another way to look at the same topic is to look at both cohorts, and I don't expect you to be able to see what the x-axis is saying, but it's just looking at both cohorts from 1933 all the way to 1944 and looking at them when they're adults and seeing what is the share of that cohort in each of these categories. And here you can see a fairly similar pattern, but a little bit more nuanced as we take into account that different cohorts are experiencing slightly different things. We've got this rapidly increasing share with matric, again, a fairly stable but increasing share with incomplete secondary, and in this rapid decline in primary and no secondary. And these kind of figures are also shown for different race groups to reflect the sort of rapid increase in educational attainment over the last couple of decades. So what have we learned? Sorry, my phone's ringing. We've seen this rapid increase in educational attainment, especially in the both cohorts that are between 1950 and 1975. And this was very much initially driven by an increase in the share obtaining grade 12. The group with incomplete secondary has remained large and actually increased in recent years, and such that at the moment we have both cohorts or even like the labor force predominantly in that range of mostly incomplete secondary and matric. And then there's very small percentage with post-schooling. So obviously these measures don't say anything about the quality of education or the in terms of learning that's happening. It's just about years of completed schooling. But what we can start to think about is if we look at that proportion that is completing tertiary education, it does start to sell a picture. And what we saw is that the proportion did increase. It almost doubled between 1993 and 2012, but it's from very low base and it still represents a very small proportion. And also when we shifted to looking at the cohorts, there was actually a little bit of a decline in recent birth cohorts in the share obtaining tertiary education. What you also might realize from looking at this graph, if we think about this group, the group with matric grade 12, completed grade 12 education, if we think about them and as being eligible to continue with especially university education, the proportion of them going on to complete tertiary education has actually dropped quite substantially, which is obviously talking to a couple of things, but one of them could be about preparation for furthering education. So that was very much about the trends in education, and I'm not going to show you any figures looking at sort of returns to education, but I'm going to summarize a couple of points that come out of the work that's been done with PALMs. And the early work was obviously done just on individual waves, and by putting PALMs together, it's the sort of consistency of the picture has come out. But South Africa has very high returns to education. That shouldn't be post-school education, just education in general. And this has been increasing over time. A university graduate, for example, can earn close to 3 times the amount of someone with grade 12 and up to 5 times the amount of someone with grade 8. And we don't only see returns to earnings, but also returns to finding a job. And this is even though there are stories of graduate unemployment, if you look at post-secondary graduates, their levels of unemployment are far lower than the national average. On the other hand, we've seen this drop in returns to that group where we saw so much growth, that incomplete secondary group, those with grade 8 to 11. So that's sort of overall pictures on the returns. So I'm not going to talk about the third area of research that I identified. I imagine that with David talking next, he would go into that in detail. But I thought it would be nice to illustrate how PALMs can feed into other platforms in a very useful way. So the changes that we observe in these sort of relative returns to education, obviously are quite an important part of the story of earnings inequality in South Africa, and it forms part of the motivation we have for thinking about tracking this group that we often call just tertiary in many of our analyses, and sort of stopping and unpacking it and thinking a little bit more about what it means and why it's not necessarily growing as fast as we might think, or some of the work has also shown some changes in the returns in that group, and sort of unpacking who's actually benefiting within the tertiary group in the labor market. So the Siya Phambili website is an interactive website, and it tracks the proportion of South Africans with a post-school qualification. I use the term post-school qualification because this is any qualification that is achieved outside of the basic schooling system. So that means you don't have to first complete your grade 12 to continue. This is inclusive of our colleges and our university system. Now, all the data or all the graphs on the website, the Siya Phambili website, are created using the PALMs dataset. And you can just imagine that the effort involved in setting up a website like this was extremely reduced because we had access to PALMs. So this is just a snapshot from the website and shows qualification attainment over time. We've got 2 types of qualifications, what we've termed high value qualifications, which are those typically thought of as post-school education, and then any qualification which includes your qualifications that your sort of NQF 2 and 3 level qualifications. So those are qualifications that you have from colleges that might be thought of as equivalent level on the NQF as some of the other the schooling system. So here you can see that if we look at the proportion of the population aged 15 to 65 that has this qualification, we've seen it increase from about 7% to close to 14% over the periods that PALMs has, so doubling. But again, when you look at the difference in these lines, you see that the growth has come more strongly from those other types of qualifications that aren't necessarily as highly valued in the labor market. So just to unpack it further, especially in the later waves of PALMs, the details in the qualification category are more substantial. And so you can start to break down what this tertiary group consists of. And here I'm just displaying it for these years. And you can see that there's been some shifts, even in a fairly short period, in the proportion of the population with these types of qualifications. So you can see a growth in bachelor's degrees and certificates. But what also shows that there's quite a, it's not necessarily, well, to me, it wasn't, I didn't know beforehand that most of like the highest proportion of qualifications is coming from, for example, diplomas. So it also allows you to understand how the composition is laid out. We also show some of these different trends in by different subgroups to sort of start to unpack where there's been growth and not. So I'm not going to go into there, but I encourage you to go and look at the website. We are currently updating it, so it's going to have some new additions, but all the data is from PALMs and can be directly, and the sort of data used here then is consistent. So I thought I think I'm sort of out of time, but I think I started a bit late. So I just want to think a little bit about some of the sort of measurement ideas and how it relates to education and PALMs, and also in terms of PALMs going forward. Whether it be PALMs with GSHS or PALMs with the QLFS. And I mean, the big picture point I think to make is that the household surveys are really our only way to link or easily link the sort of levels of education, and especially this tertiary area of education with the labor market, and really unpack what's happening in the education sector and then what it means in terms of labor market outcomes. And so if we're thinking of the sort of substantial amount of investment and support of students in education, it really does feel like a useful instrument to refine, to allow us to say something about this relationship. And as that share of students obtaining, whether it be, you know, certificates from TVET colleges or universities, head into the labor market to really understand what's going on. So some of these things I've said before, and I'm not going to touch on all of them, but thinking about what pieces of information we could include in PALMs that then allows us also to think about that going forward. I think I've actually got that on the next slide. But yeah, so one of the key things that I've encountered, and PALMs deals with it by putting these different categories of education, or these five different variables in, is that there's the categories that are included in the measurement of highest educational attainment have changed a lot over time. And even though they've changed a lot over time, and many of the changes seem to be working towards aligning with the national qualification framework, there's still categories on this variable that don't really align. And I'm also not sure whether respondents necessarily know what these different categories mean. So thinking a little bit about really aligning sort of the labor market ideas with sort of what's happening in the higher education sector, I think could be quite useful. And then also thinking about what that actually means in terms of when you go and measure it. How do you end up getting a certain, you know, classifying someone as a certain group? Yeah, and I mean, then that also feeds into our thinking about the sort of years of education variable. And most of the researchers I know, and this includes the variable in PALMs, we have sort of these standard assumptions that we use to create this overall years of education variable. But if we start to think of that tertiary group in a little bit of a different way and what we can actually learn from these different groups, then how can we put the data together in a way that informs that? Yeah, so I just make the point that, if you're tracking changes over time, and this tertiary group in particular is shifting in terms of who they actually are and what's it actually measuring, then you can end up with misleading information. Okay, and then last thing I want to say is from 2012, there was the QLFS has introduced this field of study variable, which I think could be a useful variable going forward. And yeah, that's something we can talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, and now, last but not least, David. So yeah, thanks again for giving us a kickstart on PALMs. That really helped. And I know you've been watching us from afar, and yeah, we just wanted to get your perspectives at this stage. You're on mute, David.
Sorry, I think I'd never done this before. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I don't have any slides. Just going to make a few comments. Congratulations to Martin, Andrew, and the team on this 10th anniversary milestone for PALMs. It's a big deal, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm speaking with several hats, I guess. As noted, I played a quite modest role in the origins of PALMs, but I'm very proud of having helped get it started. I'm a heavy user of PALMs myself. I go to it regularly for a number of projects, especially studying trends in earnings, returns to schooling, earnings inequality over time, joint with Nicola, some of that work just overlapping with the work she just presented, work with Murray Lebron, Arden Finn, others in the great SALDRU pantheon. I recently completed 6 years as director of the Institute for Social Research at University of Michigan, which is a unit that, like SALDRU and DataFirst, devotes enormous amounts of time and resources to generating and distributing data for public use. Through our Survey Research Center, we actually collect a lot of data, such as the panel study of income dynamics, and through our ICPSR Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, we, like DataFirst, take a lot of data collected by others, including national statistical agencies, but also researchers, and put those data into user-friendly form and consistent formats and make them publicly available. So I have always really believed that generating and distributing publicly accessible data is one of the greatest public goods that there is in the social sciences. It's always been one of the hallmarks of SALDRU, even before the creation of DataFirst, and DataFirst has been an important vehicle for furthering this goal. I thought I'd say a few words about my role in this, and partly just this whole issue of making data sets compatible, and as a way to sort of talk about how unique and exceptional the PALMs is. So I kind of got into this originally working in Brazil, which has excellent annual labor market survey. I started working on it in the 1980s. And I started collecting some of these surveys, which was quite a lot of effort at the time, and involved like bringing back boxes and boxes of 9-track computer tapes from Brazil, all of which anybody can just have sitting on their laptop now. But as I worked with many graduate students on it, and we'd get different years of data, and of course the variable names are different, and there's a lot of coding to be done to make everything consistent and change all the missing value codes, and just little kind of nuts and bolts of working with data that we got kind of systematized. And when a new one would come out, we could just sort of run it through our food processor and add it to the series. And it was quite a consistent series, very, very rich data, over 100,000 households a year, and it got into that. And then of course things would get complicated when they would redesign the survey and change the questions and change the coding, and we would struggle in consultation with our Brazilian collaborators about how to make those things compatible. So I'd done a lot of that in Brazil. Then I started working in South Africa, and originally came and met Francis Wilson in 1996, and he invited me to come on sabbatical, which I did, and spent a year, 97, 98, out on the Hitting campus, which many of you will remember. Spent a lot of time, as many researchers did in those days, working with the 93, 94 PSLSD data, which at the time was quite remarkable for how publicly available it was, how user-friendly it was. It actually drew many international researchers into working on South Africa. And of course, the time when working on South Africa was a fascinating thing to do anyway, but the data was right there at the right time. Then along came the OHSs and then the LFSs, and as has been indicated, I sort of got involved in making these compatible over time in a similar way as I'd done in Brazil, of just dealing with the changing variable names and dealing with all the missing values and the changing coding and so on. And then that was very pleased when Martin absorbed that into developing the much more ambitious PALM. So I say that partly just to indicate kind of the kinds of things it takes to work with different surveys. There is a lot of value in making harmonizing surveys. IPUMS, the project at the University of Minnesota, harmonizes the US Census data, makes it publicly available. Then there's IPUMS International, which I think has been a great project, harmonizing international census data. ICPSR, part of ISR at the University of Michigan, that spends an enormous amount on this. And it's incredibly valuable, but in some ways it's kind of the easy part, not that it's all that easy. What PALMS has done that goes so far beyond that is actually diving deep into the kind of apparent anomalies and inconsistencies in the data, just looking to see how consistent the data are, especially on variables like employment and earnings, even education, as Nicola notes, a relatively easy variable to keep consistent over time, but changes in the coding, changes in the schooling system itself create a lot of issues there. And even getting that right takes a lot of work, and it takes researchers with expertise thinking seriously about them, diving into them. So I've always been impressed with the work that Martin's done and Andrew, diving into earnings over time, employment over time, what's going on with the sample weights, what's going on with the sample design, what's going on with imputation. These are, I'm really pleased to see how many people are here. It's the kind of thing that happens at Michigan. Not everybody out in the world can imagine people getting so interested in issues like this of sample imputation and sample design and questionnaire design and so on. But it's really the nuts and bolts of where the data come from. So DataFirst and PALMS has really taken this to a whole nother level with serious economic research about these questions, bringing in issues of survey design and survey methodology, and it's absolutely fascinating to observe. when you do that, you, as Andrew showed, you sometimes find disturbing anomalies that make you nervous about working with the data. And I think that's always a challenge, maybe something we can talk about. You know, I and my collaborators would love to have a nice, consistent series of earnings from 1994 to the present for South Africa. And, you know, in fact, when it's very clear and it's a real public service that PALMS has demonstrated, you know, there's a lot of issues. You want to go into this very, very humbly and carefully. And there's also a lot of guidance about what to do and what variables to use and what variables not to use and what to think about, what kind of weights to use. These are absolutely fundamental issues. And of course, these issues of income inequality and employment are, needless to say, absolutely first order issues. So we want to get them right. We want to understand them. We can only do it with the data. And we need more than just the data. We need the kind of deep analysis that goes with it. The other thing I just like to mention is I'm a big fan of collaboration, interaction between government statistic agencies and universities. That's part of what has always been central to ISR. As is noted, StatsSA should get a lot of credit for collecting a lot of great data over the years. They do an incredibly good job. And they're to be much praised for making these data publicly available and making them available to, so this kind of work like PALMS can be done. Not every statistical agency in the world does this by any stretch of the imagination, and StatsSA has always had a very good record on it. And I think it's this partnership of StatsSA collecting the data using the great capacity they have, and then university units like DataFirst and researchers there like Andrew and Martin and Nicola diving deep into the data and doing the kind of work that we all need. So congratulations, it's an amazing project, and I'm very happy to be here for it. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so what we wanted to do is just throw it open. So there've already been quite a few questions raised in the chat. So yeah, if somebody wants to pose a question directly, now's the time to do that, or reflections, comments on what we should be doing. So I mean, the fundamental existential question really was raised by Andrew, and that is where we're sitting now. Do we continue releasing updates on PALMS, given the fact that we're becoming skeptical about particularly the earnings information? So that's been one of the key uses of PALMS, whether it's in the national minimum wage debate or what have you. And I mean, one of the things that PALMS does, it makes good research easier, but it also makes it much easier to produce garbage, unfortunately. So there's no foolproof way of actually releasing data and making sure that's only used correctly. But yeah, if the value add becomes too low, then at some stage you say, well, actually, we've done this now for 10 years, maybe that's enough, and we leave it at that, particularly given the fact that this is also an unfunded project, as it were. I mean, so we've scrambled bits and pieces of money from all sorts of places, but unlike IPIMS, which, I mean, that's their core business model. They get people to pay for the harmonization, and that's what they do. And yeah, we don't have those sources of funds. So there were quite a few hands that went up. So I think that the first one that I saw was by, is it Janet?
It is, it's Janet, thank you. Just first of all, congratulations to the team and for your hard work. I have chatted to Andrew about some issues that I've experienced. And I just wondered, with having kind of this panel of experts together here in one place, David too, who's worked with the coding as well. I've had a problem trying to merge some of like, for example, the LFSs with PALMs, because Nicola's spoken about the importance of cross-entropy weighting when trying to use this for trend analysis, the data for trend analysis. And with the updates to some of the PALMs data sets, when you try and merge with previous LFSs, and I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, it keeps suggesting that the unique number, person number, do not uniquely identify observations. And this is, I don't know, as I say, if anybody else has experienced this problem. And I just wondered if
I think let Andrew answer that. So typically you need, so for some of them, there may be strings in the original one. We've taken them as numbers or vice versa. So you may have to do that kind of conversion. Andrew,
I've done all of that, yes. I've done those conversions. It's just that some of the do files too are quite outdated, and they don't work with the newer versions of PALMs. So, but I have attempted all of that. I've actually spent an incredible amount of time on this. So I just wondered if anybody else had experienced this.
Isn't there also a household ID to
yeah,
help identify
so basically, so in some of the data sets, we've got household ID and person code. It might be better to do this offline, because I suspect that this is going to go down a rabbit hole. But in principle, we do have mergers, and if they're not working, that is something that we do want to know about, because obviously that's something that we need to fix. But I think that is a sort of nuts and bolts type of question, which I think is probably going to require somebody to sit on the computer and try and reproduce your problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any other comments and questions? So there was one comment in the chat, which I thought would be worth kind of like raising. So there was a question about the QES, the Quarterly Employment Series, or whatever it's called, and using that to cross-check PALMs. So the first problem is that the raw data for that is generally not available. So Andrew and I had a version of it, which, so there are other issues with that. So that you're looking at it from the firm side. In principle, that's kind of a really interesting set of questions. Why do the firm level numbers not match up with the labor force survey type of numbers? I wrote on that in an ILO paper back in 2014 already, where actually it turned out you couldn't get them very close, even in the best case scenario. And I think that talks more generally to the fact that, like, as you cut through the data from different slices and from different perspectives, you get slightly different information. And I think that the more of that we have, having 3 or 4 lenses on the same problem, should theoretically give us more insights into what is wrong with each. Then to harmonize those would be another level of complexity, which is, so just harmonizing the LFSs by themselves, QLFSs, is an issue. Harmonizing across different data sources takes that to a different level. But that really is the kind of research project that we almost require. So part of the problem is that too often we're quite willing to be schizophrenic. So use the data from the one series for one set of results, and then use the LFSs for something else, never mind the fact that they're actually incompatible when you look at the same problem from the two sources. So if I had another 60 years on my life, I might kind of like try to tackle those, but I think that there's scope for many PhDs on that. Andrew, do you want to talk about that?
No, I mean, I've done a little bit of work talking about using PALMs and the QES aggregate numbers, because as Martin said, we don't have microdata, and comparing them. And again, the QLFS does look quite strange compared to some of the other ones, even the national accounts data, the tax data, and the QES that I suspect is about the strangeness is coming from the imputations, but it's hard to prove that without actually getting the unimputed data.
There are a couple of other questions in the chat. I know that Dory had one about the employment numbers in the General Household Survey. I don't have an answer for that, but I think that those are the kinds of questions which, you know, are kind of really interesting. So for some of these years, we have GHS data, we have NIDS data, we have QLFS data, and we could come up with 3 different numbers, you know. So this is another version of that issue of the QES. I think that having more views on the same problem in some ways is interesting, because I think too often people want to make policy with one number, not realizing that actually, you know, there's uncertainty around it. So typically people don't even talk about, you know, sampling noise. So in the policy debate, frequently they just want the number, not the confidence interval around it. But the confidence intervals are all calculated assuming that the raw data is right, you know, that basically that there's no measurement error, no systematic bias. And one of the things that putting, you know, 2 or 3 data sets onto the same problem is that you start seeing that actually some of those measurement issues are probably a first order important rather than, you know, than just the, you know, the nuisance that we hope that they are. Are there any people who want to kind of, you know, verbally ask questions? I can't monitor the chat and talk at the same time.
I'm not sure how to put my hand up on Zoom, sorry, but I've got a question whether the code for the CE weight 1 variable could be made public, because I know how to update the PALMS dataset with the latest QLFS datasets, but I just struggle with creating that weighting variable and like when earnings data becomes available past 2019 quarter 2. I think Takwanisa creates that variable.
So there's 2 issues. So the one is basically you need to know what the demography should look like so that it's consistent. So that basically requires some demographic modeling. So in the latest version of PALMS, that demographic model was created by Rob Dorrington in conjunction with Takwanisa and Andrew. So basically, yeah, so there was kind of a bespoke model to try and give us the full time run that we were after. So yeah, so basically to update it, you'd need to update the demographic model. So no, actually, I don't think there's a shortcut to doing that. And once you've got the demographic model, then obviously it's running that cross entropy estimation routine to calibrate it, which is, I must also say, is not something to be entertained lightly. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of a health warning. So we do release the codes for some of that stuff, but I created the baseline code, unlike normal Stata, which is very forgiving and pops you lots of error messages if you do it incorrectly. I didn't do any of that error trapping. So it's very easy to end up in a state where things either freeze or bomb, and you won't be the wiser, unfortunately. So that's just a health warning. Reza, you've got your hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great. I've tried to put on my camera too. So I have a very quick question, which really is just, I want to say unequivocally that I think PALMS is a fantastic resource and that it should continue. So the next question I have is, what would it take in order to ensure that it does continue? Does DataFirst need funding for this? Or does it need additional resources from a coding point of view? Can you give us some sense of that? Because I think that even if we have poor quality, or what might be thought of as poor quality data from Stats SA, for whatever reason, right? Low non-response, a large part of the sample not having phone numbers during COVID, so that we lost a lot of that sample. What PALMS has done, which no other data set and no other institution in South Africa or anywhere else in the world has done, is by virtue of the attempts to do everything from imputation to calibrated weights, it's brought together a coherent data set that is talking honestly about the different sources of survey error that may be exerting influence on the point estimates and even imputed estimates at any given point in time. So I would think there's even more of a responsibility almost on the PALMS team to continue that work when the data quality has dropped for an external shock like COVID. So then the question becomes, how do we resource that? So I just wanted to get your views on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so funnily enough, that's one question I'm not prepared for, because I haven't actually priced that, you know. So basically, I guess when we hired Andrew, it was the cost of a research officer and then a senior research officer and associate professor. But I mean, there was a lot of other kind of sweat equity that went in there, which came from the fact that it spoke to the research interests of Andrew and myself, you know. So there's I guess, a lot of unpaid components in there. So the key question, I guess, is that if you were to try and make this independent, what would that cost? I don't really have a answer to that. But I mean, it would basically, at minimum, be, you know, the salary of a sort of research officer to kind of run the codes. So that's just to maintain it, as it were, you know, like to do the other stuff, to actually almost kind of do the research to think, well, how do we adjust for any of the shocks that have happened? That I suspect would take to take extra, you know. So that's, yeah. So I mean, in some ways, this wasn't meant as a sort of fundraising effort. It was kind of more like a celebration. We've done it. If people, you know, feel that's useful, you know, what are the kinds of things we could think about taking it forward? And then I guess who should, you know, what should go into it? And then I guess, so there was the fundraising thing in the back, you know, who should we tap for funds, but how much is going to cost? That was not a question that that I had actually priced, you know. So yeah, so that's a way of kicking that for touch. But yeah.
Can I say something, Martin?
Sorry, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess it depends, Riza. I have a brief answer, not a very well-considered one, but I mean, the whole point of David's excellent code that we then extended is to make the cost of adding in surveys very low. So in one sense, it's easy. I mean, as I said, I've done a new version of PALMS myself, and because of the way that the code is structured, it's pretty easy to do that. So the difficulty, I think, is do we do that just as is? Do we, the cost of putting it out as is pretty low. I mean, I need to find time to write a new PALMS guide and make the font size on the section that says the earnings data is not very good bigger, so that more people would notice that when they were using the guide. But, so in that sense, the cost is low. But, in another sense, Martin and I have both sort of independently realized that the weighting looks a little bit suspicious, and Martin's doing quite a lot of work on trying to see if he can, improve the weights that are in the QFS. The earnings data is not very good, so we put it in, but I'm the one that mentioned funding, so apologies. I also wasn't planning on making this a fundraising exercise, but it would take money to, for example, spend more time trying to convince Stats South Africa to make the data available or improve the weights, or so yeah. I mean, in one sense, the cost is low. In another sense, actually very high. So yeah. Those are my thoughts for you, Riza.
So I think just also to, so when Andrew says that running another wave is pretty easy, it's not entirely true, in the sense that basically you'd still need to kind of update the demographic model. But also, I mean, the key question is, we don't really want to put stuff out where we know the stuff is kind of, in a sense, worse than the original, kind of like, so it must be value added rather than just, there are too many projects in the world which basically smash raw data together in a way and then release it in a recycled form. Sometimes there's value to that, but very often, so harmonization happens, whether it's the World Bank or Luxembourg Income Study. There are lots of projects whose core ideas, just to kind of like standardize things, and often that is very useful. But there's also danger, which is basically that if you don't exercise your brain when you update it or when you put new things in, that actually you in a sense, you miss those breaks, or you miss the problems that are in the raw data, and then you paper over cracks which actually you shouldn't be papering over. So we are at 5:30, and actually my neighbors have started their sound system. So there's going to be some background noise coming in a minute from my side. So I think I want to round it off in the next couple of minutes. We did say we're going to go till about 5:20. We're already sitting at 5:30. So yeah, so thanks to everybody for joining us. I do want to give people a chance, just to any wrap-up comments. So Dory, your hand has gone up.
I just wanted to say thank you to you and everybody at DataFirst and who works on PALMS for the fantastic work that you do. From all of us, I'm sure. Thanks, Martin, Andrew, David, Nicola, and everybody else.
Thanks, Dory. Yeah, so we do it for the appreciative audience we have. There are some people where we, quite frankly, are amazed what they do with it, not in a good way. So then sometimes you ask yourself, was I really complicit in some of the stuff that's going out there? But yeah, it has been used in all sorts of great ways by all sorts of people, and that is actually quite rewarding. Yeah, so I mean, maybe just to close things off, can I just ask in reverse order, David, any last thoughts from you?
No, thanks. It's a great project. I do hope it continues. I see the challenge, and I think this is always an issue of, are we always better off with data, or sometimes data just lead to confusion? But I hope it can continue, and there's many of us international fans out there cheering it on.
Thanks, David. Nicola, any last comments from you?
Sorry, there's quite a lot of background noise here as well. But yeah, so I also think just having a resource like this does create these platforms to think about, or even like different components of the household surveys generally. So I think there's so much benefit to continuing this on going forwards. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. The one thing actually I did want to draw attention to, the one use of PALMs which Nicola pioneered was really that cohort type of stuff. That is one big advantage that PALMs are set up in such a way that you can actually do cohort type of analyses. And I mean, even in the education data that Nicola showed earlier, that kind of is a different cut through the data, which is actually extremely useful. Yeah, and then Mr. Palms, Andrew, I don't think you'll escape that kind of identification. Any final thoughts from you?
No, I don't think I have anything to add, Martin. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about PALMs, and thank you to everyone who's chipped in with bits and pieces and questions. And while Nicola was talking, I remembered that she was the one who pointed out that one of the public versions of PALMs got the education coding wrong, because we didn't realize that the education question had changed in 2016 or whenever it was. So thanks to Nicola for that, and for everyone else who does the same. Yeah, those additions and helpful hints are part of what makes PALMs better. So thanks.
Yeah, so that crowdsourcing of suggestions and inputs, I think, are important for our work. And so it is great to see so many of you here today. So it does feel like, we've come a long way over 10 years. We've learned a lot of things that we didn't want to learn about stuff. We thought that hopefully the quality would improve over time. Not always clear that was the case, but yeah, we've learned a lot of things about data, the labor market over the last 10 years, and hopefully we'll continue to do so. So thanks everybody for coming here. And as I said, this has been recorded. We will make that available in some shape or form for people who weren't able to be here. Thanks. Yeah, and with that, goodbye.
Thank you.
That's all. Bye.
Bye.
Nice to